A judge was interviewing a woman about her divorce. Judge: What grounds do you have for divorce? Woman: About 4 acres with a cozy little house and a creek running through it. Judge: No, I mean, what's the foundation of your marriage? Woman: Oh, mostly concrete, brick, and mortar. Judge sighs: What are your relations like? Woman: Well, I have an aunt and uncle in town. Judge: Do you have a grudge? Woman: No, just a 2-car carport. We never needed one. Judge: Ma'am, is there any infidelity in your marriage? Woman: Oh yes, both my son and daughter have stereos. We don't love their music, but we tolerate it. Judge, getting frustrated: Does your husband ever beat you up? Woman: Oh sure, he wakes up earlier than me at least twice a week. Judge, exasperated: Lady, why do you want a divorce? Woman: Oh, I don't want a divorce. My husband does. He says he can't communicate with me. A young Arab boy asks his father, Dad, what's that weird hat you're wearing? The father smiles. Ah, my son, this is a chechia. In the desert, it protects our heads from the scorching sun. And what about that long flowing robe? Ah, that is a jalaba, my son. The desert is not only blazing hot, but the sand is always blowing. This keeps my whole body protected. Okay, but what's with those weird shoes? These? These are babouches, my son. The desert sand may look beautiful, but it burns like fire. These keep my feet safe. The boy nods, then asks, So tell me, Dad. Yes, my son? Why are we wearing all this crap? We live in Birmingham. A month before my wedding, my fiancée told me she had left her favorite hoodie at her sister's apartment and asked me to go pick it up. I knocked on the door, and her sister answered, wearing tight yoga pants and a low-cut top. I'd always thought she was attractive, but today, she looked stunning. Her hair was damp from a shower, and the scent of her lotion filled the air as she hugged me. She handed me the hoodie, but as I turned to leave, she leaned in and said, What's the rush? No rush, I stammered. Just didn't want to keep you from whatever you were doing. She smirked. Look, I know you're about to marry my sister, but I need you to know. I think you're insanely hot, and I've always wanted you. If you want one last bit of fun before the wedding, no one will ever know. My heart pounded. Without a word, I turned and bolted for the door, sprinting straight to my car. And that's when I saw them, my fiancée, her parents, all standing there, grinning. Her dad clapped me on the back. Son, you just passed a very difficult test. I'm proud to see my daughter marrying such an upstanding man. Her sister walked up behind me, smirking. Gotta hand it to you, I didn't think you'd turn me down. I was speechless. We all hugged and went out for dinner. And the moral of the story, always keep your condoms in the glove compartment. A month before my wedding, my fiancée told me she had left her favorite hoodie at her sister's apartment and asked me to go pick it up. I knocked on the door and her sister answered, wearing tight yoga pants and a low-cut top. I'd always thought she was attractive, but today she looked stunning. Her hair was damp from a shower, and the scent of her lotion filled the air as she hugged me. She handed me the hoodie, but as I turned to leave, she leaned in and said, What's the rush? No rush, I stammered. Just didn't want to keep you from whatever you were doing. She smirked. Look, I know you're about to marry my sister, but I need you to know. I think you're insanely hot. And I've always wanted you. If you want one last bit of fun before the wedding, no one will ever know. My heart pounded. Without a word, I turned and bolted for the door, sprinting straight to my car. And that's when I saw them, my fiancée, her parents, all standing there grinning. Her dad clapped me on the back. Son, you just passed a very difficult test. I'm proud to see my daughter marrying such an upstanding man. Her sister walked up behind me, smirking. Gotta hand it to you. I didn't think you'd turn me down. I was speechless. We all hugged and went out for dinner. And the moral of the story, always keep your condoms in the glove compartment. Dave was excited to land an interview for a signalman job on the railways. The inspector asked him, What would you do if you realized 2 trains were heading toward each other on the same track? Dave replied, I'd switch the points for one of the trains. What if the lever broke? Asked the inspector. I'd rush down from the signal box and use the manual lever. What if that had been struck by lightning? Then I'd run back to the signal box and call the next one. What if the phone was engaged? I'd run up to the level crossing and use the public phone there. What if that was vandalized? Well, I'd run into the village and get Trev. The inspector, puzzled, asked, Why would you get Trev? Dave shrugged and said, Because he's always wanted to see a train crash. Two friends are walking their dogs, a Dalmatian and a Chihuahua, when they catch the smell of something delicious from a nearby restaurant. The guy with the Dalmatian says, Let's grab a bite. The guy with the Chihuahua protests, We can't. We have dogs with us. The first guy smirks and says, Just follow my lead. He puts on a pair of sunglasses and walks into the restaurant. Sorry, says the owner. No pets allowed. This is my seeing eye dog, says the guy with the Dalmatian. A Dalmatian? The owner asks, confused. Yep, they're using them now, the guy replies. The owner pauses for a moment, then shrugs. All right, come on in. The second guy with his Chihuahua follows suit. He puts on his sunglasses and tries the same thing. Sorry, no pets allowed, the owner says again. But this is my seeing eye dog, the second guy claims. A Chihuahua? The owner asks, incredulously. The second guy sighs and says, A Chihuahua? They gave me a Chihuahua. A televangelist, a rabbi, and a Hindu holy man all have car trouble in the countryside and ask a farmer if they can spend the night. The farmer says, I only have room for 2 to sleep, so one of you will have to sleep in the barn. The rabbi immediately volunteers, No problem. My people wandered the desert for 40 years. I'm humble enough to sleep in the barn for one night. He heads out to the barn, and the other 2 settle in. A few moments later, there's a knock on the door. The farmer opens it to find the rabbi standing there. What's wrong? The farmer asks. The rabbi replies, I'm grateful, but I can't sleep in the barn. There's a pig in there, and my faith believes pigs are unclean. The Hindu holy man agrees to swap places. A few minutes later, there's another knock at the door. What now? The farmer asks, now a bit exasperated. The Hindu holy man says, I appreciate your kindness, but there's a cow in the barn, and in my country, cows are sacred. I can't sleep on holy ground. Finally, it's the televangelist's turn. He grumbles and complains, but reluctantly heads to the barn. Moments later, there's yet another knock at the door. The farmer opens it to find the pig and the cow standing there. A woman wakes up in the middle of the night to find her husband missing from their bed. She puts on her robe and heads downstairs to find him sitting at the kitchen table staring at the wall, a cup of coffee in front of him. She watches as he wipes away a tear and takes a sip of his coffee. What's wrong, dear? She asks, stepping into the room. Why are you down here at this hour? The husband looks up at her solemnly and says, Do you remember 20 years ago when we were dating and you were only 17? The wife, touched by his sentiment, nods. Yes, I remember. He hesitates, struggling to find the right words. Do you remember when your father caught us in the back seat of my car? Yes, I remember, she replies, now sitting down beside him. The husband pauses again, then says, Do you remember when he shoved a shotgun in my face and said, Either you marry my daughter, or I'll send you to jail for 20 years? I remember that too, she says softly. He wipes away another tear, then says, Well, I would have gotten out today. I would have. When NASA was preparing for the Apollo project, some astronaut training took place on a Navajo reservation. One day, a Navajo elder and his son were herding sheep and came across the space crew. The elder, who spoke only Navajo, asked his son to translate, What are these guys in the big suits doing? A crew member explained they were training for a trip to the moon. The elder, excited, asked if he could send a message to the moon. Seizing the opportunity for some publicity, the NASA team handed him a tape recorder. After he recorded his message, they asked his son to translate it. He refused. The crew took the tape back to the reservation, where the rest of the tribe listened and laughed, but still refused to translate. Finally, NASA called in an official government translator. He listened carefully and then translated the elder's message. Watch out for these guys. They've come to steal your land. The new CEO of a company is determined to make a change. He walks around the office and spots a guy leaning against a wall doing nothing. He approaches the man and asks, What do you think you're doing? The man replies, I'm just killing time, waiting to get paid. The CEO, furious, asks, How much do you make a week? The man answers, About $200. The CEO pulls out his wallet, hands him $400 and says, "There's your 2 weeks, now get out of here." As the man leaves, the CEO turns to the employees and asks, "What do you think of that?" One employee stands up and says, "I think he just got the biggest tip he's ever gotten on a pizza." A young reporter went to a retirement home to interview a legendary explorer. He asked the old man, "What's the most frightening experience you've ever had?" The old explorer began, "Once I was deep in the jungles of India. I was walking along a narrow path and my faithful native gun bearer was behind me. Suddenly, the largest tiger I've ever seen leaped onto the path in front of us. I turned to grab my weapon only to find that my gun bearer had fled." He continued, "The tiger leaped toward me with a mighty roar, or I just soiled myself." The reporter, trying to be understanding, said, "Under those circumstances, anyone would have done the same." The old explorer smirked and said, "No, not back then. Just now when I went raw." A couple was celebrating their golden wedding anniversary, and their domestic tranquility was the talk of the town. A local reporter, curious about their secret, asked them how they had managed such a long and happy marriage. The man smiled and said, "Well, it goes back to our honeymoon. We visited the Grand Canyon and took a trip down to the bottom by pack mule. Not long into the journey, my wife's mule stumbled, and she quietly said, 'That's once.' He continued, 'We went a little further and the mule stumbled again. She said, 'That's twice.' We hadn't even gone half a mile when the mule stumbled a third time. My wife calmly pulled a revolver from her pocket and shot the mule dead." The reporter was shocked. "You yelled at her for shooting the mule, didn't you?" The man grinned. "I did, but she looked at me and said, 'That's once.'" General leaps tall buildings in a single bound, more powerful than a steam engine, faster than a speeding bullet, gives policy to God. Colonel leaps short buildings in a single bound, more powerful than a shunting engine, just as fast as a speeding bullet walks on water, if the sea is calm, talks with God. Lieutenant Colonel leaps short buildings with a running start and favorable winds, almost as powerful as a speeding bullet, walks on water in indoor swimming pools, talks with God if special request is approved. Major barely clears a Nissen hut, loses a tug-of-war with a steam engine, can fire a speeding bullet, and swims well, occasionally addressed by God. Captain makes high marks trying to leap tall buildings, gets run over by trains, sometimes handles a gun without injury, dog paddles, talks to animals. Lieutenant runs into tall buildings, recognizes trains 2 out of 3 times, is not issued ammunition, can stay afloat if properly instructed in the use of a life jacket, talks to walls. Second lieutenant falls over doorsteps while entering buildings, says "Look at Choo-Choo," is never issued a gun or ammunition, plays in mud puddles, mumbles to himself. Sergeant Major lifts tall buildings and walks under them, kicks steam engines off the track, catches speeding bullets in his teeth and eats them, freezes water with a single glance. He is God. A young woman's husband dies and leaves her the farm in his will. However, the farm turns out to be far too much for her to manage alone, so she decides to advertise for a farmhand. The best candidate is a young man who's terribly shy, but something about him makes her wonder if her lonely life might one day be over. He works tirelessly, day and night. Within weeks, the farm is not only back to normal, but more profitable than it's ever been. The animals are happy, and the corn is as high as an elephant's eye. The farmhand doesn't speak much, though, and never takes a break. The woman realizes she hardly knows anything about him, even after all this time. Eventually, she decides to take action. "Look," she says, "everything is running smoothly, yet you haven't had any rest. Why don't you take the evening off? There's a great bar in town, and I think you'll enjoy it." "All right," he says, and after supper, he heads into town. He returns in the early hours of the morning and is surprised to find his employer still awake. He enters to see her lounging on the sofa. "At last, you're back," she says. "Now why don't you take off my boots?" He swallows nervously and takes off her boots. "Good," she says. "Now take off my blouse." He hesitates, but removes her blouse. "Now, my tights." He rubs his hands together, then takes off her tights. "And now my bra." He coughs nervously, then takes off her bra. "Now," she says, If you ever go into town wearing my clothes again, you're fired. Farmer Tom is in the middle of plowing his field when his tractor breaks down. He tries to fix it, but has no luck, and he needs to finish the field today. I know. I'll ask my old mate Farmer Bob for help, Tom thinks. Tom and Bob have been neighbors and close friends since childhood. There's nothing they wouldn't do for each other. But Tom is a natural worrier, and as he walks over to Bob's farm, his mind starts to race. What if Bob can't fix it? Well, I could ask to borrow his tractor. But what if he's using it? What if he's lent it to someone else? What if he just doesn't want to lend it to me? What if... Eventually, Tom arrives at Bob's farmhouse and knocks on the door. After a moment, the door opens. Bob, hello, Tom. Lovely to see you. Fancy coming over for a bite to eat tonight. Anyway, what brings you over? How can I help? Tom, you can stuff your tractor up your bottom. A blind man went to the hospital for an eye operation. After the procedure was completed, the doctor checked on him and asked, "Can you see now?" The man shook his head and said, "No, Doc, I still can't see anything." The doctor, trying to figure out the issue, jokingly said, "Let's try something unusual." He called the nurse over and asked her to remove her clothes. "Can you see anything now?" The man paused for a moment and replied, "No, still nothing." The doctor chuckled and raised an eyebrow. "You cheater! If you can't see, why is your package waking up?" A man eagerly waits for his wife to give birth. The doctor comes in and solemnly informs him that his son was born without a torso, arms, or legs, just a head. Despite this, the father loves his son deeply and raises him with care, compassion, and unwavering devotion. 18 years later, the son reaches the legal age for his first drink. The father, filled with emotion, takes his son to a bar. With tears in his eyes, he tells him how proud he is and orders the strongest drink the bar has. The patrons look on in curiosity, and the bartender shakes his head in disbelief. The boy takes his first sip, swoosh, plop, and to everyone's astonishment, a torso pops out. The bar goes silent for a moment before erupting into joyous cheers. The father, overwhelmed, eagerly urges his son to take another drink. The crowd chants, "Take another drink." The bartender, unamused, simply shakes his head as he polishes a glass. The boy takes another sip, swoosh, plip, plop, and two arms emerge. The bar is in an uproar, and the father, overcome with emotion, begs his son to keep drinking. The crowd chants even louder, "Take another drink! Take another drink!" The bartender continues to shake his head, indifferent to the spectacle. By now, the boy is getting tipsy, but with his new hands, he grabs his drink and takes the last gulp. Plop, plip, and two legs appear. The bar goes wild. The father collapses to his knees, tears streaming down his face as he thanks God. The boy, now standing on his legs, stumbles toward the door, weaving left and right as he heads out into the street, only to be tragically struck by a truck and killed instantly. The bar falls silent. The father moans in grief, while the bartender, sighing deeply, says, "He should have quit while he was ahead." You've all heard of the Air Force's ultra-secret high-security base in Nevada, right? It's called Area 51. Well, one afternoon, the Air Force personnel stationed at Area 51 were shocked to see a Cessna aircraft landing at their highly classified base. Immediately, they impounded the plane and hauled the pilot into an interrogation room. The pilot explained that he had taken off from Las Vegas, got lost, and just happened to spot the base as he was about to run out of fuel. The Air Force wasn't buying it. They started a full FBI background check and held him overnight while they investigated. The next day, after thorough questioning, they finally concluded that the pilot was, in fact, just a lost civilian and not some secret agent. They filled his plane with gas, gave him a stern "you did not see anything" briefing, with a side of prison-time threats, pointed him in the direction of Vegas, and sent him on his way. But the very next day, to their complete astonishment, the same Cessna returned. This time, the MPs surrounded the plane, ready for action. The pilot jumped out and said, "Do whatever you want of me, but you've got to tell my wife where I was last night." At some air bases, the Air Force operates on one side of the field while civilian aircraft use the other. The control tower sits right in the middle. One day, the control tower receives a call from an aircraft. "What time is it?" The tower responds, "Who's calling?" The aircraft replies, "What difference does it make?" The tower responds, "Well, it makes a big difference. If it's an American Airlines flight, it's 3 o'clock. If it's an Air Force plane, it's 1,500 hours. If it's a Navy aircraft, it's 6 bells. If it's an Army aircraft, the big hand is on the 12 and the little hand is on the 3. And if it's a Marine Corps aircraft, well, it's Thursday afternoon." Chief Red Bull took a bride, and in time she gave birth to a son. True to family tradition, he stepped out of the teepee, saw a hippopotamus in the river, and promptly killed and skinned the animal. He proudly presented the hide to his wife. As time passed, Chief Red Bull took another wife, and when she gave birth to a son, he presented her with a grizzly bear's hide. A third wife gave birth to a son, and he gifted her the pelt of a golden hind. As the boys grew, a natural competition arose among them, with the eldest always being stronger than his 2 younger brothers. Eventually, the 2 younger boys decided to team up, hoping to defeat their older brother. But the older boy still held his ground, and the struggle continued for hours until all 3 collapsed in exhaustion. And that, of course, proves the old saying, "The son of the squaw on the hippopotamus is equal to the sons of the squaws on the other 2 hides." The husband leans over to his wife and asks, "Do you remember the first time we had sex together over 50 years ago? We went behind the village tavern where you leaned against the back fence, and I made love to you." The wife smiles and says, "Yes, I remember it well." "Okay," he says, "how about we take a stroll back there again and do it for old time's sake?" "Oh, Jim, you old devil, that sounds crazy, but good." A police officer sitting in the next booth overhears their conversation and chuckles to himself. "I've got to see this," he thinks. "I'll follow them to make sure there's no trouble." The elderly couple slowly gets up, leaning on each other for support with their walking sticks. They make their way to the back of the tavern, where the old woman lifts her skirt and the old man drops his trousers. She leans against the fence, and the old man moves in. Suddenly, they explode into the most passionate sex the policeman has ever seen. They continue for about 10 minutes, making loud moaning and screaming noises. Finally, they collapse, panting, on the ground. The policeman, stunned, watches them. He thinks to himself, "This is unbelievable. There's something about life and old age I never knew." After about half an hour of catching their breath, the old couple struggles to their feet, puts their clothes back on, and begins to walk away. The policeman, still amazed, decides to approach them. "Excuse me," he says, "but that was something else. You must have had a fantastic sex life together. What's your secret?" The old man, shaking, looks at the officer and barely manages to reply, "50 years ago, that wasn't an electric fence."